Hi everyone, it's great to see that you've all made it to the third and final talk of the day. We hope that this will be a very interesting session that will be invaluable as you work on your projects this week.
I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Fiona Truscott, who will be walking you through the design process. Dr. Fiona is a senior research fellow at the Faculty of Engineering at University College London, and she has been awarded the UCL Engager of the Year award for her work.
So without further ado, I will now hand you over to Dr. Fiona Truscott. Please do be engaged in the chat box and send in any questions you have for Dr. Fiona, as we will have some time for Q&A at the end of the session.
Over to you.
Cool. Thanks for the introduction, guys. I'm just going to get my slides up. Yep. Okay. So thanks for the introduction. As Amelia and Deep said, I am a teaching fellow with the Integrated Engineering Programme. So for those of you who are at UCL engineering students, you've probably already seen my face and are aware of the Engineering Challenges module, which is our project design module, our team project design module in our first year. So I'm going to talk about the design process. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is design. So before we talk about what the design process itself is, what is design itself? This is a definition from the Cox Review of Creativity in Business. So design is what links creativity and innovation. It shapes ideas to become practical and attractive propositions for users or customers. Design may be described as creativity deployed to a specific end. So that's what the kind of definition of design is. What we're very interested in is, what is good design? I think we can all recognize, we can all come up with ideas of things that are good design. The classic is the iPhone. You know, one of the definitions of good design is you tend to not realize how good it is until you compare it to something that is not as good. So we all kind of take for granted how easy iPads are to use. I got an iPad about a year ago for the first time. It was my first piece of Apple technology. And I was amazed by how intuitive it was, because I like to think of myself as pretty technically savvy, you know, like I think I can probably find my way around most technology, but just interacting with the iPad and how easy and intuitive it was compared to some of the Windows tablets that I've used, you were just like, oh, I see why everyone raves about this now. The flip side of that is, what is bad design? I think for a lot of us, this picture may sum it up. It makes everything harder. It makes everything difficult to do. It's really difficult to use. It's, you know, I cannot touch it. I don't want to use it. I don't want to interact with it. And what we really want to do is aim for good design and try and avoid bad design. So particularly for engineering and kind of engineering related topics, design is important. However, historically, it's been treated as a kind of the thing that happens at the end of the process. You create your design, and then you get your designers in at the end to put a nice wrapper on it to make it look nice so that you can sell it. And that's the historical treatment of design. But actually, there's a kind of revolution in the way why design is considered important, and actually designers are now involved from the beginning. If we go back to the Apple example, there are people from the beginning thinking about how users use it, how they're going to design the interface, and that impacts on the technical solution of how do I, sort out the Bluetooth so that it works. Okay, so we want the Bluetooth to be intuitive to use, and the aim is eventually to make it better meet consumers' needs and desires. And this means that the former role is tactical. It's very much, how do I get someone to buy this? How do I make it look pretty? And the latter is strategic. It's about creating something that people really want to use and want to keep using again and again and again. This is I really love this diagram. It helps you kind of thinking about design in a kind of visual way. So we sometimes talk about innovation in engineering. So we're looking to produce innovative products. We're looking to produce new products, stuff that's creative, and design really helps us to do that. And we can kind of think of design as the desirability. So how do we get humans to want it Feasibility is the kind of technical, what classical engineering is sort of thought of as, can we do this? And then the viability is the business side. So finance is again really important for this. If you create something that's 10 grand, you need to know you can get enough people to buy your 10 grand product that makes you, you know, at least break even, if not make money. So these are all really important, and these are all really important factors to be thinking about from the beginning of you working out what your design product is, or your solution to a problem is, because there are so many things that have, you know, people have gone down the feasibility route and realized that actually there is no one's going to buy this, no one wants this, and there's no point putting all that effort in and then it failing because you haven't really thought about desirability or viability. So the design process. I say design process, but there are lots of different ways of talking about this. Really, what we want to know is, how do I get from problem to solution? Because it can seem quite vague. I've got a problem, I need to get to a solution. And really, that process is just the design process. That's what we're talking about there. And again, as I say, the design process, there are lots of different kinds, ways of articulating the design process. If you put the word design process into Google, you will find versions from the Design Council, you'll find versions from the RCA, you'll find probably our version, we have a version, you know, loads of people, different people have different versions of the design process. But really, it kind of boils down to five basic stages that you need to think about. So this is the problem stage. This is where you identify what the issue is that you actually want to solve. And this, you can start off this stage very big. So, you know, some people start this stage with climate change, question mark, as the problem they want to change. Some people start this stage with, you know, I want to improve communication options for people. I want to improve accessibility to various different kinds of technology. But what you probably want to do is, if you've got something big like climate change question mark, you probably want to break it down into something smaller, because climate change question mark is a very big problem and you're unlikely to find the one solution to it. So you want to think about what little bit of the problem you can tackle. So is it, for example, reducing the use of plastic bottles? Is it, for example, reducing the amount of water that's used to create clothing? There are loads of different ways to address climate change. And you need to work out which little bit you want to work on, because trying to tackle it all is just going to be too much work. Second stage is research. Now, research may help you with that analysis problem of getting it into a smaller problem that you can work. It will also really help you find out what your parameters are. You know, how much does it have to cost? What is a maximum? What laws do you have to obey? What do your users want? What does the funding require you to do? There are loads of different questions that go into the research section of this, but it's really about finding what you can and can't do, and giving you some parameters for both working out what your design idea is and then how you test it subsequently. So, ideas. This is the one that I think everyone's really familiar with in the design process. This is where you get as many post-it notes as you could possibly do and stick them on a wall with all your many ideas. This is the thing that you see, you know, engineers doing on telly. So when there's like a TV, you know, Iron Man, when he's talking about doing loads of ideas, it's just, this is ideas, right? I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. This can be quite fun. Some people I find this quite fun. You can get quite creative at this point. I know engineers hate using the word creativity because they're like, oh, we're engineers, but engineering is a really creative subject. It allows you to do some really fun, interesting things. So in this, you want to come up with as many ideas as you can based within your parameters that you've identified in your research. So, you know, something really outlandish, like, you know, maybe we're going to solve climate change by entirely moving to another planet. Maybe that won't work. Maybe you cross that idea off because that doesn't fit. And the idea is to come up with, the aim of this stage is to come up with 2, 3, it depends on the project and the ideas themselves, that you then want to take into the next stage, which is testing. We also call this stage prototyping. You might have heard it referred to. The idea is to test your ideas out, because there are some things that you simply do not know until you have a model or a physical kind of version of it, or a digital version if it's an app or a piece of software. Until you put it through its paces, there's some stuff that you simply can't know about your ideas. You know, will they fail at this point, or maybe it might also help you to refine those ideas. So for example, you know, what materials do you need to be using it out of? What size does it need to be? The size is a big problem for me. I find it very difficult without a 3D kind of, even if it's made from cardboard and the final thing is supposed to be made from metal, until I've got something in my hands and I can go, oh, right, it's about that big, that makes sense. I think that's the size that works for people. You know, just having a drawing and saying this is, you know, X number of centimeters, I'm like, I've not really got a feel for what that is in kind of 3D space. So this is the testing phase. This is where you make or break your ideas, essentially. Are they going to work? Are they not going to work? And out of this, you really want to come up with one final idea that you can then deliver. And this is the stage that I think a lot of people tend to forget about the design process, is that you really have to be able to deliver your solution to the wider world at scale. So I come from an organic chemistry background. And what's really interesting is in the process of designing a new drug, there are actually two stages of kind of design development. The first one is identifying a candidate. So we try and, you find a new drug, you test it on the disease that you're looking for, but then you've got to work out, how do you create this drug on scale? And that tends to be very different types of chemistry to simply creating something on a small scale. And there's a whole, if you go to a pharmaceutical company, there are two separate departments to deal with these two different issues of finding a new drug and creating it on a scale that you can then, have paracetamol tablets in every shop going, so you can get it out to everyone. And it is a separate stage, because in some cases it can be a really, an entirely new problem that you have to think about how it works. Obviously with some things, so for example, if you design an app, delivery is very easy. You upload it to the App Store and then it gets, people download it. But it depends on the project. But it really, you do have to think about how you're going to deliver it to people. Now, the way I've discussed this is in a very linear, you go from one and then to the next one and to the next one and to the next one. Real life is messy, very messy. The design process is not this like 5 stages and then I do one and then I do the next. And it's obvious what I should be doing next. You're almost certainly going to have to do a few stages around and around. So maybe some rounds of coming up with ideas or some rounds of research, doing it again and again. Almost certainly you're going to go back and forth between them, between different stages. So something may come up in your research and you realize that actually the problem you've identified is not that much of a problem, or is you've focused your problem wrongly, and actually it needs to be, your focus of your problem needs to be different because the research says that actually this is what users want, or this is what people will fund, or this is how this works. And even you might end up going back multiple stages. So, something in testing all your ideas may break, and actually you have to go back to your research and find out some more information so you can modify your ideas. This is all completely typical. Like every designer goes through this all the time. The fact that you have to go back to a previous stage is not failure. It doesn't mean you've done it wrong. It's just we get new information and then we have to revise what we're looking at. It really is that simple. And it's this iterative, we try again and we try again and we try again. And talking of doing things multiple times, you might find that this is not just referred to as the design process, but the design cycle. So again, there are multiple design cycles. This is the one that we use at UCL Engineering. And you can see that it's actually got different stages in it to what I described. And that's because design cycles expand on some stages, they separate out different steps, they combine stages. But those basic 5 stages are in every design cycle, every articulation of the design process. And the reason we sometimes refer to this as a design cycle is because you just keep going around and around and around and around. So those of you who are UCL students will be very familiar with this. We use this all the time. We have a slightly different version that we use in civil engineering, but it's got the same language. But comparing it to the 5 stages that I identified, the need/brief stages are really the problem and research stages. You know, there's a slightly different split about what's in particularly which stage, but really this is about working out what your problem is and doing your research to work out what your parameters are. Conceive is just a different word for ideas. That's what that stage is. Testing and instruct and specify. So that's test is really your prototyping, modeling. And then instruct specify is where you work out what your final design is. So, you know, this is where you work out where those, you know, blueprints that you kind of classically see, you know, in engineering offices on TV, where they'll have the blue paper with the blueprint. This is what we do. That's the instruct specify. This is what the final solution has to do. This is what it needs to be made of. This is the size, that kind of final design. And that's really the testing stage, those two together. And then again, delivery is really the make, build, manufacture. So how do you get it to the point where you're going to then, you know, ship it to stores or, you know, send it to people? And then the use is that, you know, what are the people doing? How are people using it? You know, are they using it in the way that we thought they would? Because that's always a really interesting stage, I think. Because as much as you try to design something and ask people what they think and how they're going to use it, until people use it, you don't know. The best test, you know, we try and model, we try and prototype, but really in some cases, the best test is getting hundreds of thousands of people to use it, and you will find immediately where all the problems are. So how do we avoid finding too many problems in that end stage? That's the question. So for me, I'm really interested in the research stage. And I'm really interested in the research stage for a lot of reasons. I come from an interdisciplinary background, so I'm very interested in, you know, how we talk about different ideas, where different ideas come from. But I also really think that this is where the start of good design happens. Where do we begin having good design? And that is in the research stage. And I also think, unfortunately, in engineering, we tend to be a little bit focused on how do I solve the problem, and not very focused on who is using this. And this research is the stage where we look at this question of who is using this, how are they using this, why are they using this, what are they going to use it for? And I think this is a really important stage. Now, I've recently been reading this book. Some of you may be familiar with it, Invisible Women by Caroline Credo Perez. Basically, I'm going to go through some ideas for you to think about, for you to kind of reflect on, and a few case studies of, you know, this is the thing that I'd like you to think about. This is where they did it, or they did it, and this is the outcome they got. Quite a few of the case studies are from this book. I really recommend it if you want to get ideas about, you know, why design is so important and why thinking about who you're designing for is important. This is obviously based around the differences between men and women and designing for men versus women, but it gives you a really good idea of why this is important and the impact that design can have on people. So the first thing I want to talk about is gather the right data. This is really important. So we tend to, all the way through this is going to be, you need to kind of, you know, the stuff you assume, question it. That is going to be the kind of motto of this, because you have to kind of, you know, make sure that what we tend to do is fall back on assumptions, which is natural. That's what we do as human beings, is how we get through the day. We couldn't do it any other way. But one of the things we can do is sort of gloss over things or miss things because we've kind of assumed that our experience is the same as everyone else's. So gathering the right data is really important. So medical data. 25% of participants in 31 landmark studies on congestive heart failure between 1987 and 2012 are women. It's not quite the same amount as the number of people in the population who are women. And what it really tells you is the data we have about congestive heart failure is dominated by what happens in men. And actually more and more people are realizing that how diseases manifest in men and women is different, and that actually we need to think about those, and people are different and they come up with lots of different, there's no standard human really. So we need to everything needs to be a little bit more flexible. This one I find fascinating. So in 1977, the FDA ordered that women of childbearing age, so probably from about kind of 18 to 40, 50s, you know, anywhere around there, were to be excluded from clinical trials. This means there is no data set on medicines of women who are aged 18 to say 50. They're just not included from 1977. This order has been rescinded, but we have, you know, anything that data set, you know, any kind of medical trials post 1977 are mainly done on men. So we don't know the effect of lots of drugs on women to an extent until they're out in the population. So this is about making sure we have data on a representative sample, really, because, you know, we can assume that women react the same, but we really need some evidence for that. And what's actually found is this, you know, even though this order has now been rescinded, you know, in some clinical studies, the number of women involved in it are as low as 18% of the participants are women. So we're really not getting a lot of data on women in clinical trials. And so this is a big data gap that we've just, you know, we're basing our conclusions and our ideas on data that's not really representative of the wider societal sample. So trying to find out those data, gather the right data, get the right data set. The other thing that I find fascinating, and there's going to be a theme of how much I love public transport. I love public transport. I find it really fascinating. Public transport is another area where we have a very big gender data gap, but there is some indication that men and women don't use transport in the same way. And you kind of assume, oh, you know, transport is kind of gender neutral, right? People use buses. Everyone can use buses. But actually it isn't, as it turns out. So women are more likely to walk and take public transport. In fact, in one of the few studies that do segregation on gender of their data, 2/3 of public transport passengers are women in France. Fascinating. You know, why are women using public transport and walking more? Do they tend to not have cars? You know, women tend to prefer walking or public transport? Are they taking shorter journeys? So that's not, you know, they are just walking around the corner to the shops or something more. Fascinating reason, you know, there's loads of reasons why this might be. And what's interesting is even in transport patterns, men and women are different. So men tend to do a simple in and out. They're effectively home, work, work, home. That's what they tend to do. That tends to be their travel pattern. Women tend to do this thing called trip chaining, which is lots of small interconnected trips. So for example, women do home, school, work, pharmacy, school, after school club, home again. So they're doing these kind of multiple center trips where you're going through loads of different places. So even just transport patterns are different between men and women. And this is really interesting because this, you know, can lead to different ways of thinking about how you design your transport system. One of the things we have in London, for example, where women are 25% more likely to trip chain, we tend to have lots of arteries in and out. So if you look at the tube diagram, or even a lot of the bus maps, they go from the center outwards. It's like this big spider, essentially, with a lot of legs, this kind of pattern. And what we don't have is a lot of lines that go round. There's the circle line, classically named circle line. Some of the overground does go round, but also even with some of the bus routes, you find that the more of them kind of go up and in and out from the center to the outside than kind of go along. And so women tend to end up taking more time on their public transport journeys than men do, because men are going, oh, I'm going down and then in and then back out again. And women want to kind of go sideways. So they might have to go in and then out and then in and then out again to get to different areas around the circle. So, I mean, even this is kind of the data that you need to collect. So, you know, if you want to build a new tube line, you need to think about how people use the tube before you want to work out, you know, you can't just go, there's a space, I'll stick the tube there, right? You want to be thinking about how are people using this and what is the best place to put new tube lines or new bus routes. So that might be like, oh no, how do I get data? I'm going to have to do lots of surveys, right? I'm going to have to go and ask tons of people how they use it. Do not worry, you particularly now, you don't necessarily want to be going out and asking a lot of people a lot of information. We want to try and socially distance as much as we can. There are fantastic data sets out there, just the best data sets. So my Google search history looks awful because I would work on a lot of student projects and just, trying to find data sets for students. So one I've been looking at about public transport, you can get the National Travel Survey data set from the government. The government has tons of data sets online where they've done information gathering exercises, and they give you not just a summary, but the data itself that you can then play with. Another one, so I work with students on a project on tuberculosis, and WHO has a big database where you can find tuberculosis profiles for pretty much every country that's a member of WHO in the UK, in the world. So this is the one for the UK, and it tells you stuff about the number of TB cases, also stuff like how easy it is to get treatment. Particularly they're concerned by HIV positive and HIV negative people because it has an outsized impact, TB, on people who are HIV positive. So you can get all of this data from WHO about the instances of TB across the world, and the treatment capacity, and how many people recover and how many people don't, and what the effect is on different groups of people. And another one that I worked on with some students on water quality. So there are various charities that collect data sets as well. This one is from Thames 21. They do a water quality results survey that you can get on the Thames, that you can look up what the pH of the Thames is at various points, and how much waste is in there, and what the particulate level is. And there's loads of data sets out there, so you don't have to go and collect your own. You can just use these metadata sets that you can collect, and then reanalyze and look for what you're interested in. So designing in isolation, this is a really important one, right? You need to think about how your design is going to fit in with the person you're designing for lifestyle, because the classic one is you design something and then people go, this doesn't fit my lifestyle, it's not going to work. And I find this one really, really interesting. So usually lots of people, the kind of first stoves that people use are these things called 3-stone fires. They're 3 stones to balance a pot and fuel in the middle. So we've got here a plate actually where someone is making tortillas, but it's the same idea. They've balanced the hot plate on top of the fuel in the middle, and they're cooking over the top of there. South Asia, 25% of families still use biomass fuels in these kind of the traditional stone fires, and there are 2 problems from them. They're inefficient, and you can see that from that picture with the flames going up the side. Anything above the plate is not heating the plate, so those flames are not really helping introduce heat to the plate and cook the food on there. They also produce a massive amount of smoke and fumes. It's the equivalent of more than 100 cigarettes a day, and we're all aware of how bad cigarettes are. So imagine, you have this in your house, and it's just a lot of smoke and fumes. And there has been a drive to introduce what are called clean stoves, so that stoves that are more efficient and produce less smoke and fumes, since the 1950s. But uptake has been very patchy, and people tend to not transfer to this new kind of stove. And the official answer, if you look at various studies, is that these people come from a conservative culture, and they really need to be educated about the amazingness of our new stoves. It's really kind of pushing the reason that you haven't decided to use my new thing is because you just don't understand how good it is, which I would argue is a very bad way to work as an engineer or as a designer, because you're supposed to be creating something that people want to use. You need to find out what they're interested in. And actually, for several years, people have, the user experience collected is that these kind of stoves, they increase cooking time, they require more tending, so you can't kind of multitask. You can't leave something on the stove and then walk away and go and do various other things. You've got to stay there, so you can't multitask. You're not as efficient. The stove itself isn't as efficient. And so people just like, why, you know, why would I use this stove if it just makes my life harder? And what happened is researchers in 2015, they went, before they started designing something, they went and asked, what do you want? Why is it that you know, we've been trying to get people to use these new stoves. There are benefits to them. Why will no one use them? And basically they discovered the point above, that, you know, user experience is that, you know, they're not as useful. And so what they decided to do was design an inexpensive device. I think it's less than $1, and it modifies, you put it in your existing 3-stone stove, and that reduces fuel use and reduces smoke levels. It's very easy to do. You don't have to install an entirely new thing in your house, that you just kind of get the thing and then put it in. You can see a lady there using it, preparing a fire before she lights it. It's very easy to use and it makes sense to everyone. So, you know, it works with their lives and it reduces fuel use and smoke levels, but it also cooks at about the same rate as previously. It, you know, is about the same level of, you know, required for interaction, so you can multitask as you used to. So it just fits within people's lives really, really well. So really think about how someone's going to use something. One size fits all. So this one, I'm coming back to the public transport, but basically we tend to think of, there will not be one solution to your problem, because people are different and they're going to want to use things in different ways. They're going to want to be trying to do different things with it. And really you're never going to come up with the solution. This is the answer that I have for you. This is how we will do this. You've got to think about a range of different answers. So to kind of illustrate that, I'm back to my lovely public transport. So you're probably all aware that a key policy to reduce the amount of CO2 is to decrease car use by encouraging people to use public transport, because public transport is a lower CO2 producing method of getting around than cars. And this is, you know, great policy. It's adopted all over. Everyone's trying to use it. And it works really, really well if you live in London, like I do. So this is a screenshot of the number of buses. So each circle is a London bus on the roads in London. This screenshot was taken at 5 to 11 on a Friday night. And there are hundreds of buses, you know, in London. If you want to get a bus, you maybe, you know, you're unfortunate if you have to wait 10 minutes for a bus, you know, it's a terrible day. You know, you can get buses. There are 24-hour bus routes. There are night buses. You can get a bus pretty much whenever you need to pretty much everywhere in London. You know, there is usually a bus route nearby wherever you live in London. I grew up in Wiltshire, which is a county in the southwest of the UK, and has a very different bus map. The equivalent evening bus service is here. For kind of size purposes, Wiltshire is about twice the size of London in terms of area, and these bus routes show, basically they show where at least one bus runs on this route after 8 p.m. So you can see there are large parts of Wiltshire that, if you want to go somewhere after 8 p.m, yes, that's a shame. You're going to have to get a car. There is no bus. To be honest, the daytime bus map is not that much better. This is the daytime bus map. You can see there are a few more routes, but each of these routes has at least 4 buses a day on. That's the that's the minimum. Whereas we can, you know, London bus routes have one every 10 minutes typically. So it's really difficult to take public transport around Wiltshire. So one of the questions is why? Why is it so difficult? Do we just need to create more bus routes? And the answer is actually no. Creating more bus routes won't work, and that's to do with population density. This is the population density of London. The darker the colour, the more people. It has an average population density of about 5,700 London, so that's people per square kilometre, and it's a population of nearly 9 million in a kind of 1.5 square kilometres. So it's pretty dark. It's a very highly densely populated area, London. It's in fact one of the most densely populated places in the world. Wiltshire, on the other hand, lot of white. So anything coloured white is under 50 people per square metre. It's got an average population density of about 200. We don't even have a population in the county of over 1 million. And there's actually relatively little urban centres. Wiltshire is almost primarily agricultural land. There's a lot of agricultural land. It's one of the primary economic activities in Wiltshire. And this explains why increasing the number of bus routes won't help, because we simply don't have the population density to sustain them. They wouldn't make money. They'd be loss making. The government would have to put in a significant amount of money for bus routes to make sense. And that's because people live in little villages. There may be one person a week that needs to go to somewhere else. So people in Wiltshire, they can't really reduce their car use very much, right? Because there isn't really an alternative, and there's no alternative that makes kind of financial or really kind of viable sense. But that doesn't actually necessarily mean that the people of Wiltshire can't reduce their carbon footprint. So down the road from the town that I grew up in is this solar farm that's been built. So they've taken over several fields outside of the town I grew up in and have covered them in solar panels. And what's nice about this is because they're raised off of the ground, actually you can use these for mixed use. So you can have sheep grazing around underneath your solar panels. And this is generating, enough power to, I think it's to power something like 3,000 homes a year in Wiltshire. So this is how one of the ways that Wiltshire can reduce its carbon footprint is by increasing its renewables, which you simply can't do in London. Can you imagine taking over like Regent's Park and just covering it in solar panels? No one would want that. And we simply don't have the space in London to be able to do that. So what you need to be kind of aware of is that you're going to have to tailor everything, and this solution might work here, but it might not work there. And it'll be one of multiple solutions that you'll be working on. Diversity, this is a key one. This is really important in engineering, is talking about diversity of voices. So just a quick note on what we mean by diversity. We tend to think of things like gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation when we talk about diversity, but actually what I want you to think about when we talk about diversity is a much wider set of indicators. So it includes cultural background, socioeconomic background, past employment, time management. It's all those different experiences that everyone has had. Everyone comes with a different set of experiences. And really, when you're designing something, you want to either work in a team with as many of these different voices as possible, or try and get data from as many of them as possible. Because they may come up, with something completely from left field that you hadn't thought about, because it's just not in your area of experience. And that can be really helpful and really come up with a really new idea. It can also help you from kind of failing badly having diverse voices in there. And in this case, literally. So I don't know how many of you remember when Siri first came out in the iPhone 4S, it completely failed to understand Scottish accents. There were many very irate Scottish people trying to shout at their Siri and get them to understand. It's actually a problem that continues with stuff like Alexa, and Amazon Echo and all of those things, is they kind of shout at them. And there are lots of videos. One of my favorite quotes from a slightly different article is that it misinterpreted "can you dance with me" with "can you Dutch woman," which is a very different sentence that someone is looking for there. Yeah. So that's the kind of really interesting thing, is why does it not understand Scottish voices? And the answer, I can't give you an exact answer, but what tends to happen in these cases is that the data set that's being trained on has very little in the way of Scottish voices, and the people creating it don't necessarily know a lot of Scottish people. You can imagine, if it's being designed somewhere in an Apple research development in, Silicon Valley, there's not necessarily a high percentage of Scottish people living there or even working there, and they, even if there is, some Scottish people working for Apple, they may not have, the wide range of accents that you find if you look across the entire, Scottish, the all of Scotland, you know, all the different Highlands accents, Glaswegian accents, that kind of stuff. So basically it's that, you know, you don't have enough data, you don't have enough information. But if you'd had one Glaswegian there and they'd tried Siri in the kind of beta phase before it gets released, you would have come up against this problem and you would have said, oh no, this Glaswegian, it doesn't understand this Glaswegian person. So having as many voices as possible is helpful, literally in this case, to train your Siri. It also can stop you doing stuff like this. So again, this Vic released Vic for Her recently. I think it was a couple of years ago, with the idea that these were pens specifically designed for women. So I suppose it's nice to have inclusion. It's nice to have products that are designed specifically for you. Personally, if I'd been in this management meeting as a voice, and I would have said, I'm kind of fine with pens. I think we should try. Nope, try again. You know, pens have not been a problem for me. And having diversity in your design team will help you with these kind of problems, these kind of issues. Outside the box. So you want to kind of, don't be afraid to kind of think outside the box. I love this story. So Carl Koga in Sweden in 2011 was asked to look at all their policies through a gendered lens. So what is your impact on both men and women, and is there a way to modify your policy so you're impacting them equally? And someone was like, snow clearing doesn't seem very gendered, it'll be fine, you know, it's not going to be a problem. And so usually they start with major arteries and end with pavements and cycle paths. It's kind of standard, kind of close, you know, priority system on transport routes. And they were like, it'll be fine. And then all that data I talked about in how people use public transport and the fact that women are more likely to walk than men in particular, they were like, oh, maybe it does have an impact. So what they decided to do was switch the order. Pavements first, major arteries last. And they did this for two reasons. Basically, the costs are the same, so it's easy for them to try it for a year and see what happened. And also, they kind of thought it's probably easier to drive a car through snow than to push a buggy through snow. I don't know if any of you have attempted to push anything through snow. I've tried to push a rolly suitcase through snow, and it's very difficult. So they were kind of like, okay, we'll try it. We'll see how it works. And actually, people liked it. But one of the things they discovered was that it saved them money, as it turns out. Now, a little bit of a tangent. The majority of injuries in northern Sweden that require hospitalization are from pedestrian slipping in icy conditions, right, on pavements. And the cost of all of these winter injuries is estimated to be about the same, about twice the cost of winter road maintenance. So it's a lot of money. We're talking millions of euros here. So what they discovered is that if they cleared the pavements first and made that a priority, they reduced the number of slips and therefore the number of hospitalizations and therefore the amount of money that was being spent on these winter injuries. And therefore overall, their kind of government system saved money because they were reducing the amount that they were spending on healthcare. And it's amazing what you can impact by changing something that you might not have found as something particularly obvious to change. So I don't think anyone, when they thought about snow clearing, were thinking they would reduce the healthcare budget, but these things are all interconnected. This step, the research step, is also where you can bring in some interesting bigger issues. Some of you may be familiar. This is Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham is a utilitarian philosopher. He particularly worked on ethics. And he left his body to UCL, which is why we have him essentially in the student centre now like this. And what ethics is really about is about reducing harm. So you want to be able to identify the harm that your project might have. There are some harms that we cannot simply reduce or get rid of. What you want to know is then, how do I mitigate that? For example, if you are creating a dam by flooding a valley, you may need to do that so you can create a hydroelectric plant, but you're going to displace some wildlife, you may even displace people, a village. How are you going to mitigate that? And how are you going to judge whether or not displacing those people is worth building your plant? Now, that may seem like something that's not really in the ballpark of engineers, But really what it is you're going to be involved in these projects, and more people want to know that they're working on ethical projects. Same with thinking about sustainability. So we tend to think about sustainability as environmental impact, but it actually has a social and economic side as well. You want your project to be able to roll out into the future without having minimal kind of interaction or intervention, really, is what you want to avoid. So, you know, do people use your service? Do people buy your product? Can you fund it by selling the products that you've created? But also the more familiar version of, you know, can you make sure that you've got a renewable source of materials, that your waste is not causing environmental problems? And you can start thinking about that in this really early stage of the design process of research, because you design something as being sustainable, that is much easier than going, I've got this solution, I now need to make it sustainable, because you're probably going to have to completely re-engineer it potentially anyway. So practical issues, because those are some big thoughts, some big ideas, and it's like, that's great, but how do I practically do this? How do I practically think through these ideas? One of the things is we teach around a design system called human-centered design. And human-centered design is about putting the people that are impacted by your design front and center. These are usually users, but they can also be, like, for example, if a charity is funding something, they may also be your kind of people that you want to put front and center. This is in opposition to problem-centered design, where you put the technical problem that you want to solve front and center. So I prefer human-centered design. I think it's a better way of thinking about design. It really allows you to do all that stuff that we talked about in terms of good design. It's not an idea that we in the IEP came up with. There's a fantastic design kit. It was created kind of, this company, IDEO, do some fantastic work. I really recommend going to their website, because they have some fantastic explanations of human-centered design and talking about why it's important and the impact that they've been able to do on projects using this. They also have this thing called the Field Guide to Human-Centered Design, which has a big guide full of activities. And it's like, how do I practically do this? What am I going to do? So it's stuff like, for example, you know, if you need to go and interview an expert, there's some steps, there's some information about, you know, what are you going to need to take with you? How might you find your expert? That kind of thing. What are you trying to get out of your expert? Like, what information are you trying to get out? Another one here is about defining your audience. So it's about thinking who are you looking to talk to with your design, or who are you looking as your user base. And so this I really recommend it. It's a free PDF, and it really helps you kind of, if you're looking for some activities, if you're looking for some inspiration, this is a really good resource to use. One of the activities I particularly like doing with students, and I think this one is a really good kind of quick way of just getting an idea of who is it your design is impacting, and I really recommend this for just very quickly to just kind of analyze and think about who you're talking with. So it's called Identifying Stakeholders. So a stakeholder is a person or entity that has an interest or concern in your project. This can be individuals, organizations, groups of people. Try and avoid the words general public. Try and be a bit more tailored. So like teenagers, people with houses, because the general public is a bit of a catch-all term, and it's a bit too big to be useful. The key point is these can be people who are for or against your project, because you need to know who you might be up against trying to get your project through, as well as people who you're designing for. And it helps you to focus on what they need and want. So it helps you do that, because what are my constraints? What are my parameters? You know, for example, if there's someone against your project, you know, you might not want to go down one pathway because that will particularly annoy them, you know, unless you're really into particularly annoying them. But, you know, I might want to avoid that because that's going to be contentious. That's going to be a problem. That's going to be difficult to get through, difficult to pass, whatever. Then what you want to do is a little bit of stakeholder mapping, which sounds complicated, but is really just this graph. So it's power versus interest. So increasing interest on the bottom, increasing power on the top. And you end up with these 4 quadrants, okay, based on the amount of power versus the amount of interest. And this will help you work out how to prioritize things. So you can go, okay, I need to prioritize the needs and wants of the key players, and unfortunately I shall put the needs and wants of the least important people at the bottom, because I can only do so much, and that, you know, that'll be good if I can get to there. But the basics also work. I recommend all my students to Google stuff, stick various different search terms. As I said before, my Google history is awful. Whoever is looking at my Google history is going to be like, okay, she's looked at public transport and then vaccine production, and then she's kind of thought about the Thames, and then she's thought about, you know, design learning, and she's just Googled everything. My search history is covered in stuff, because it's the easiest way for me to find out what students might find, is to do it, to Google it and find that information. So Google is a very good place to start. It's a very good way of starting your research journey and finding some information. And you'd be surprised at how much information is out there that you can access through Google. So in conclusion, first off, every presentation I do has at least one Marvel meme in, and this is my Marvel meme for this presentation. But really what I want you to be thinking about, and the kind of takeaways, is that design is basically 5 stages: problem, research, ideas, testing, and delivery. Quite how you break those up might differ depending on what context you're working in, but those are the 5 stages. And you're going to be going back and forth between those 5 stages. Research is where good design starts, and try and really embrace that stage and find as much information as you can. And try to think as widely and as varied as you can. One of the things we tend to do is fall back on our own experiences, on our own assumptions, and that's fine if you're designing something for you, but it can be a problem if you're designing something for someone else, particularly in a very different context. Ask all the questions, any question, to Google, to people, to anyone you can get hold of. Ask the questions. They might be able to provide you with some information, they might not, but you'll never know if you don't ask. And then finally, change the world, because this is how we do it. As engineers and engineering related areas, this is how we change the world, through design. So thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fiona. So if anyone has any questions, you can drop them in the chat right now and we'll get to them right. So our first question is, how can you decide to what degree of prototyping is necessary, especially when you're ideating things?
Yeah, so unfortunately the answer is going to be, it depends on your project. But I think what it is if you're in the really early stages of ideation, what you really want to be doing is very simple prototypes. So literally cut it out of cardboard, build it out of a yogurt pot. It really doesn't need to be a very complicated prototype, just to give you something that you can hold. And so that can, you know, take you kind of 10-15 minutes. You know, you don't really need to, okay, yeah, that seems about right. Before you go into kind of delivery, you do want to try and make sure you properly test something, so you have something that you can prototype properly. Depending on your project, depends on different ways of doing that. So for example, if you're building a bridge, you'll actually have to do a lot more modeling than actual prototyping. But if you're doing an app, you can prototype really, really quickly and really try and test everything out really, really quite a lot. So I think it is somewhat context dependent, but what you want to be able to do is be confident that if you scaled this up, it would work, and work for most people most of the time.
Okay. We have another question. How have you worked with inclusive design or engineering? What are some projects that have stood out to you in these fields?
So I haven't done work particularly on inclusive engineering, but I've run a few student projects based around inclusive engineering. One of my favorite projects was the IUP summer school that we did with A-level students last year. We asked them to build a piece of wearable tech for a user. And we had a wide range of users that we had there, in terms of, you know, people, lots of stuff about parents, which I found really interesting, that 16, 17-year-olds were thinking about what parents would want. But, you know, kind of to stop their children getting too close to the screen, to monitor their UV exposure outside. And my favourite one, and the one that actually won the prize for the summer school, was for partially sighted and blind people. And it was a glove with a proximity sensor, because the team's suggestion was, if you're in an enclosed space like your kitchen, it can be difficult if you're blind or partially sighted to remember where you've left something. And so they've got a glove with a proximity sensor that beeped as you got closer. And then they had a light on there. So if you were partially sighted, you could put your light on, and so you could get a bit more light on what you were trying to interact with. And they'd created this program that was all voice interacted. So you could turn the light off, or you could mute it if you were, you know, having a video call and you didn't want, you know, the beeping going off all the time. And it's really, that's my experience with it, of getting people to think through, okay, what do you know, need, what does the person need to be able to do, and what do they need to think about? And I was kind of blown away by how inventive the students were. It's just, I was like, I hadn't really thought that you'd get this far and this level, but really thinking that process through was really cool.
Thank you so much. I think that's all in the questions. Thank you for the insightful talk, Dr. Fiona. We loved especially the Venn diagram that helped define innovation in a simple yet effective way, and also the subtle humor that you had throughout the presentation. The points you raised about gathering the right data in the research stage of design were also very eye-opening, and something we hope participants will keep in mind in their own processes. We hope the participants will make full use of this guide to the design process, especially when working through their ideas in their hackathon projects, and taking each of the 5 stages you discussed and remembering the importance of points such as avoiding isolation and the benefits of diversity in design. Lastly, thank you to all the participants for joining in. Please keep up the hard work on your projects and ideas for creating a better world through inclusive design. We look forward to staying in touch with you through the Slack channels this afternoon, and be sure to ask any questions you have and make the most of this opportunity to learn from the experts and other participants. That's all for today, but make sure you get back online for our next talk at noon tomorrow with Robin Christopherson, Head of Digital Inclusion at AbilityNet. See you then. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Good luck, everyone.